Something is shifting, even if you cannot see it yet. There are moments in life when everything feels still, when prayers seem to echo back in silence and the road ahead looks uncertain. You may be doing everything you know to do, praying, trusting, trying to remain faithful, yet nothing around you appears to be changing. Days pass, weeks pass, sometimes even years pass, and it can begin to feel like you are standing in the same place while the world keeps moving forward. But the Bible shows us something powerful about seasons like this. Silence does not mean God is absent, and waiting does not mean God is inactive. Right now, in ways that are hidden from human eyes, God could be arranging pieces of your story that will soon make sense. The scriptures are filled with moments where everything looked ordinary, even hopeless, right before God moved in a way that changed everything. Joseph sat in a prison cell, forgotten by the world, yet in a single day God lifted him to a position that would save nations. David spent years running through the wilderness while carrying the promise of a crown, yet the day came when what God spoke finally became reality. And when the disciples thought everything was over at the cross, heaven was already preparing the greatest victory the world would ever see. God has never been limited by timing, circumstances, or the opinions of people. When He decides to move, doors open that no person can shut. Situations shift that seemed impossible to change. Paths appear where there were none before. What once looked like an ending suddenly becomes the beginning of something greater than anyone expected. This message is for the person who feels like they are in the middle of a quiet season. It is for the one who has been praying for change, for direction, for healing, for purpose. It is for the one who sometimes wonders if the waiting will ever end. The truth is that many of God's greatest works begin in hidden places long before they become visible to everyone else. The breakthrough often begins long before the moment when the world finally sees it. So if your life feels slow, if the answers have not arrived yet, and if the future feels uncertain, do not lose heart. God specializes in turning the most ordinary moments into the turning points of a lifetime. And according to the patterns we see throughout the Bible, the season before everything changes often looks exactly like the one you may be standing in right now. Number 1. God often works in silence before the breakthrough. There are seasons in life when heaven seems quiet. You pray, you wait, you hope, and yet nothing around you appears to move. It can feel as if your words are disappearing into the air and the answers you long for are nowhere to be found. But the silence of God is not the absence of God. In fact, throughout the Bible, some of the greatest things God ever did began during moments when everything seemed quiet and hidden. Think about Joseph. God had given him a dream that one day he would rise to a position of great authority. But after that dream came betrayal, slavery, and prison. Imagine the confusion Joseph must have felt sitting inside a prison cell. The promise God had spoken over his life must have seemed impossible in that moment. Day after day passed with no sign that anything was changing. Yet while Joseph sat in prison, God was already preparing the path that would lead him to the palace. What Joseph could not see was that God was arranging events outside of those prison walls. A cupbearer would remember him. Pharaoh would have a troubling dream. And in a single moment, everything would change. The same man who had been forgotten in prison was suddenly standing before the most powerful ruler in Egypt. Within hours, Joseph went from prisoner to ruler, from hidden to honored. This is the way God often works. While we see stillness, God is preparing movement. While we see delay, God is arranging the details. His plans unfold in ways that are often invisible until the exact moment they are meant to appear. Many people mistake silence for rejection. They assume that because they cannot see God moving, He must not be doing anything at all. But Scripture shows the opposite. God is constantly working behind the scenes, weaving together circumstances, people, and timing in ways that only He can see. You might be in a season where it feels like nothing is happening. Maybe the doors you expected to open have stayed closed. Maybe the answers you prayed for have not arrived yet. But that quiet season does not mean God has forgotten you. It may mean He is preparing something that requires more time, more alignment, and more perfect timing than you can currently see. God rarely rushes His greatest works. When He is building something that will last, He often begins in hidden places where character is shaped, faith is strengthened, and trust grows deeper. Those quiet seasons are not empty seasons. They are preparation seasons. And when the moment finally arrives, the same silence that once felt confusing will suddenly make sense. You will realize that God was never inactive. He was simply working in ways that were too deep and too detailed for human eyes to see. Number 2. The delay you feel may actually be divine preparation. Waiting can be one of the hardest experiences in life. We live in a world that values speed. We want quick answers, immediate results, and clear direction right away. When something takes longer than we expected, it can feel frustrating and discouraging, but the Bible repeatedly shows that God's timing is very different from human timing. One of the clearest examples of this is David. When David was young, the prophet Samuel came to his home and anointed him as the future king of Israel. Imagine hearing such a promise spoken over your life. Imagine being told that one day you would lead a nation, but what happened next was not immediate success. David did not walk straight into a palace and take the throne. Instead, years passed. David returned to tending sheep. Later, he faced battles, persecution, and long seasons of running for his life while King Saul tried to kill him. From a human perspective, it may have looked like the promise had failed. How could someone chosen to be king spend so many years hiding in caves and wandering through the wilderness? Yet those years were not wasted years. They were preparation years. During that time, David learned to depend completely on God. He developed courage in battle, wisdom in leadership, and humility in hardship. The wilderness shaped his character in ways that the palace never could have. When the time finally came for David to become king, he was no longer just a young shepherd with a promise. He was a man who had been refined by experience, strengthened by trials, and trained through seasons of difficulty. The delay had prepared him for the responsibility he was about to carry. This is something many believers struggle to understand. We assume that if God gives a promise, it should happen quickly, but God often allows time between the promise and the fulfillment. That space is not a mistake. It is a process. God uses waiting seasons to build things inside of us that cannot be built overnight. Patience, endurance, wisdom, and faith are all developed in moments when we do not have immediate answers. Those qualities become the foundation that allows us to carry the blessings God eventually brings. Sometimes what feels like a delay is actually protection. God may be keeping you from stepping into something too early. Sometimes it is preparation. He may be shaping you into the person who can handle the future He has planned. So if you feel like your life is moving slower than expected, do not assume that something is wrong. The delay may be part of God's design. The same God who spoke the promise is the God who controls the timing. And when His moment arrives, everything that once felt slow and uncertain will suddenly reveal its purpose. The waiting will make sense. The preparation will become clear. And you will see that God was guiding your steps the entire time. Number 3. God can change everything in a single moment. There is something powerful about the way God moves. Human change often takes years of effort, planning, and struggle. But when God decides to act, everything can shift in a single moment. Situations that looked permanent can suddenly change direction. Doors that seemed sealed shut can open instantly. What felt impossible can become reality faster than anyone expected. The Bible gives us a powerful example of this through the story of Saul, who later became known as the Apostle Paul. Saul was not someone people expected God to use. In fact, he was known for persecuting Christians. He actively worked against the followers of Jesus, believing he was doing the right thing. But one day, while traveling on the road to Damascus, everything changed. A bright light from heaven suddenly surrounded him, and he fell to the ground. In that moment, Saul heard the voice of Jesus speaking directly to him. The man who had been fighting against the message of Christ suddenly found himself face to face with the truth. That single encounter transformed his entire life. Saul did not remain the same person after that moment. The direction of his life changed completely. The same man who once persecuted believers became one of the most influential voices spreading the message of the gospel across the world. This is the kind of transformation only God can bring. One encounter with him can shift a life that seemed completely set in its ways. One moment in his presence can redirect a future that looked certain. Sometimes we assume that our situations are too complicated to change quickly. We think the problems in front of us will take years to resolve. We imagine that the path forward must be long and difficult. But God's power is not limited by the same timelines that limit human effort. Throughout Scripture we see sudden turnarounds. Prison doors open in the middle of the night. Storms calm with a single command. Blind eyes see again in an instant. These moments remind us that God's authority extends over every situation. You may be facing circumstances that seem fixed and unmovable. Perhaps you have prayed about the same issue for a long time and nothing has shifted yet. But never forget that God is capable of changing everything in a single moment. The same God who transformed Saul on a dusty road thousands of years ago still has the power to transform lives today. When his moment arrives, what once seemed impossible can suddenly become the beginning of something entirely new. Number 4. The enemy often attacks hardest before God moves. One pattern appears again and again throughout the Bible. Just before God moves in a powerful way, opposition often intensifies. The pressure increases, the difficulties multiply, and the battle becomes stronger. Many believers find this confusing. They wonder why life feels harder when they are trying to walk faithfully with God. But Scripture shows that spiritual battles often surround moments of breakthrough. Look at the life of Job. The Bible describes him as a righteous man who honored God. Yet suddenly his life was shaken by a series of devastating losses. In a short period of time, Job lost his wealth, his children, and even his health. From the outside, it appeared as though everything in his life was collapsing. Job did not understand why these things were happening. The suffering seemed overwhelming. Yet even in the middle of that darkness, Job continued to trust God. His faith was tested deeply, but it did not disappear. What Job could not see at the time was that his story was not finished. The season of suffering was not the end. After enduring that difficult period, God restored Job's life in a remarkable way. The Bible tells us that the Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life even more than the beginning. This pattern reveals an important truth. Opposition does not always mean you are moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes it means you are moving closer to something significant that God is about to do. The enemy often tries to discourage believers right before a breakthrough. If doubt can take root, if hope can fade, if faith can weaken, then many people will stop believing just before the moment God intends to move. That is why perseverance is so important. Faith is not only believing when life feels easy. Faith is continuing to trust God even when circumstances appear difficult. You may be experiencing a season where challenges seem to be increasing instead of decreasing. It might feel as though every step forward is met with resistance. But do not assume that struggle means failure. Sometimes the greatest resistance appears right before the greatest victories. When you look back at your story one day, you may realize that the hardest season was actually the moment when God was preparing to do something greater than you could imagine. Number 5. God uses your pain as preparation for purpose. Pain is something every person experiences, yet it is often the part of life we struggle to understand the most. When hardship arrives, many people immediately begin asking why. Why did this happen? Why did this season come? Why does it feel so heavy? In those moments, pain can seem meaningless, like a burden with no clear reason. But when we look at the Bible, we begin to see that God often uses painful seasons as preparation for something greater. What feels like suffering in the moment can later become the foundation for purpose. Consider the life of Moses. Before he became the leader who would guide the people of Israel out of Egypt, Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. That is a long time to feel hidden and forgotten. Moses had once lived in the palace of Egypt, surrounded by privilege and opportunity. Yet his life took a sudden turn, and he found himself living as a shepherd in a quiet desert. From the outside, those years may have looked wasted. The man who would one day confront Pharaoh and lead a nation was simply tending sheep in a lonely place. But those wilderness years were not empty. They were shaping him. In the wilderness, Moses learned humility. He learned patience. He learned how to depend on God instead of relying on his own strength. Those quiet years prepared his heart for the enormous responsibility he would later carry. When God finally called Moses through the burning bush, the preparation had already taken place. The man standing before that fire was no longer the impulsive prince who had once fled Egypt. He had been shaped by the wilderness. The same pattern appears throughout Scripture. Painful seasons often refine a person's character and deepen their faith. They strip away pride, teach perseverance, and develop compassion for others who are struggling. What you are going through right now may feel difficult and confusing, but God has a way of transforming pain into purpose. The experiences that once seemed like setbacks can later become the very testimony that helps someone else find hope. One day, the story that caused you the most tears may become the story that strengthens someone else's faith. God wastes nothing, not the tears, not the waiting, not the struggles. Every part of the journey can become part of the purpose he is building. Number 6. When God opens a door, no one can close it. There are moments in life when an opportunity appears that no human effort could have created. Doors that once seemed impossible suddenly open. Situations change in ways that no one expected. These moments remind us that God has authority over paths that human hands cannot control. The Bible gives us a powerful example of this through the story of Peter in the book of Acts. Peter had been imprisoned for preaching the message of Jesus. The situation looked hopeless. Guards surrounded the prison, chains held him in place, and the authorities intended to silence his voice. From a human perspective, there was no clear way out. But while Peter was in prison, believers gathered together and began to pray. In the middle of the night, something extraordinary happened. An angel appeared in the prison cell. The chains fell off Peter's wrists, and the prison doors opened. Peter walked past the guards and out into freedom. What had looked impossible suddenly changed in a single night. This story reveals something important about God's power. When God decides to open a door, no human system, no authority, and no obstacle can keep it closed. The limits that appear permanent to people are not limits to Him. Sometimes we spend a lot of energy trying to force doors open through our own strength. We push, we struggle, and we become frustrated when nothing moves. But when God opens a door, the effort feels completely different. The path becomes clear, and the opportunity appears at exactly the right time. This does not mean life will always be easy, but it does mean that the direction God chooses for your life cannot be permanently blocked by circumstances or by people who doubt you. You may be standing in front of doors that feel firmly shut right now. Opportunities may seem distant. The future may feel uncertain. Yet God's timing often works in surprising ways. When the moment arrives that God has prepared, the right door will open. And when that door opens, nothing on earth will be able to close what God has decided to begin. Number 7. Your perspective changes when you trust God's plan. One of the most powerful changes God brings into a person's life is not only the change of circumstances, but the change of perspective. The way we see our struggles, our waiting seasons, and even our pain begins to shift when we learn to trust that God is guiding our story. At the beginning of a difficult season, it is easy to feel overwhelmed. Problems look larger than hope. Questions seem louder than answers. The future can appear uncertain and intimidating, but faith gradually reshapes the way we view those moments. The Bible reminds us of this truth in Romans 8:28, where it says that God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Notice that it does not say some things. It says all things. That includes the confusing seasons, the delays, the struggles, and even the moments that seem like setbacks. Joseph once stood in prison wondering how his life had turned in such a painful direction. Years later, when he stood as a ruler in Egypt, he was able to look back and see something he could not see before. What his brothers meant for harm, God had used for good. The story that once looked like betrayal had actually been the path God used to position him for something greater. This is what happens when perspective changes. What once looked like a closed road begins to reveal itself as a hidden path. What once looked like failure becomes preparation. What once looked like an ending becomes a new beginning. Trusting God does not always remove the challenges immediately, but it changes how we walk through them. Instead of living in fear, we begin to live with expectation. Instead of assuming the worst, we begin to believe that God is still writing a story we cannot fully see yet. When faith shapes your perspective, even the hardest seasons lose their power to define you. You begin to understand that God is working on a timeline larger than your current moment. The chapters you are living right now are part of a bigger story that is still unfolding. And sometimes the greatest transformation is not only the change God brings around you, but the peace He builds within you while you wait. Conclusion. Throughout the Bible, we see the same pattern again and again. God often works quietly before the breakthrough appears. Waiting seasons become preparation seasons. Opposition sometimes grows stronger right before victory arrives. Pain is transformed into purpose, and doors open that no human effort could ever unlock. When you look at the lives of people like Joseph, David, Moses, Peter, and Paul, you begin to realize something important. None of them could fully see what God was doing while they were living through the hardest chapters of their stories. In those moments, life looked uncertain, confusing, and sometimes even hopeless. But God was always working. He was arranging the timing. He was shaping their character. He was positioning them for something greater than they could imagine. And when the moment finally arrived, everything changed in ways that only God could have planned. The same truth still applies today. The season you are walking through right now may not make complete sense yet. You may be facing questions that have not been answered and waiting for changes that have not appeared. But that does not mean God is inactive. Often the greatest shifts in life begin long before they become visible. God may already be aligning circumstances that you cannot yet see. He may be preparing people who will step into your story at the right moment. He may be shaping your heart so that you are ready for the future He has planned. And when His moment arrives, what once felt slow and uncertain can suddenly turn into a turning point that changes everything. So if you are in a quiet season, do not lose hope. If the path ahead feels unclear, do not assume the story is finished. God has a way of turning ordinary moments into life-changing ones. The same God who moved in powerful ways throughout Scripture is still moving today. And sometimes, right before everything changes, life looks exactly like the moment you may be standing in right now.